Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. On this episode of the Ideas Factory, we will be discussing the India-Pakistan situation.
Pakistani military now has to decide which way they want to go. Within Pakistan, if you see both Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, there is a lot of turmoil there, which the Pakistani military is unable to manage. Whatever media reports that are available, I think India's message was that look, Pakistan has to de-escalate, but if we are attacked, we will respond very, very strongly.
What did really India achieve?
India did go deeper into Pakistani territory. India took its time in retaliating. India took a lot of measures which were diplomatic or economic to begin with. What is happening between US and China is also something that will impact India's own trajectory.
Everyone had questions regarding role of America there, role of China there, what did Turkey do, what was Russia's stand.
That's the real strategic challenge.
Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. On this episode of the Ideas Factory, we will be discussing the India-Pakistan situation, though there has been a ceasefire right now. And the last night has been one of those rare nights when there was no escalation and there was a night of calm in the border areas. But the DGMOs of the two countries are going to talk again, and then we will see how will this really play out in the future. But the escalation that India and Pakistan saw in the recent days, in the last 4 to 5 days, we are asking many questions on this episode. What did India achieve? What was the role of the allies here? How did it play out geopolitically? To discuss all of that, I have with me Professor Harsh Pant. Harsh, the escalation is far from over. But thankfully, there is a ceasefire. There has been a night of calm on the border areas after the high-octane clash between the two sides. The DGMOs are still going to talk. But, when we look at all that happened and we see what did really India achieve in terms of military, the escalation that took place, or politically, what did we gain, and also psychologically. Were we able to dent Pakistan psychologically, and what did we gain militarily?
I think, Naghma, there are multiple dimensions to this, as you have outlined. India's, I think, largely goal was to dismantle the terror infrastructure in Pakistan and to give a reply to what had happened in Pahalgam. I think what had happened, the terror incident that had happened in Pahalgam, certainly could not have gone without a response, and that was the feeling that you got from the very beginning, that India will retaliate in some way. India took its time in retaliating. India took a lot of measures which were diplomatic or economic to begin with, from the Indus Water Treaty being kept in abeyance to the diplomatic downgrading of the relationship, to ban on trade, visa restrictions. All of that combined, India, I think, gave a message from the very beginning that it was serious. For the first time, putting Indus Water Treaty on the table itself was a signal that something big is happening here. And I think for India, given the way the terror acts were carried out in Pahalgam and the messaging before that from the Pakistani army chief was, I think, in some ways the defining marker of this conflict. So I think as India was thinking about this a military kinetic response, it was very clear that the first target from India's side would be the terror infrastructure, and India made it very clear once it targeted the terror infrastructure within Pakistan, and this time India did go deeper into Pakistani territory.
Of course, like Jacobabad and Bahawalpur, and actually the nerve centers of the terror.
Some of these terror, like Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba. So I think there was an attempt to clearly send out this message that the terror infrastructure, wherever it is, whether it is in POK or whether it is inside Pakistan, it won't go unharmed. So in a sense, that was the start of this crisis. But I think the escalation factor was inbuilt into this crisis, because India certainly made it very clear that it would target the terror infrastructure. But Pakistan also would have retaliated as they had done in the past. So the question was, where would they retaliate? Because India doesn't have terror infrastructure. So they would have, for them, therefore, the natural target was civilians and military installations. And once they started targeting the civilian areas on the border, India's response had to be commensurate. So you see the escalation happening very, very quickly this time, partly because of the technology available. This time, the swarm drones that came in the first phase before missiles came, before the full air power was on display. So this was the first, in some ways, subcontinental drone war that happened. That you had enormous number of drones coming in towards India, India intercepting them, using its air defense systems in a way, and also then responding by taking out Pakistan's air defense systems.
Of course.
So this was a tit for tat escalatory ladder that was climbed by both sides, and because of the technology available, you could do it much quicker than before. So there was an inherent instability built into the crisis from the very beginning. And I think by the time it reached the end game in some ways, where India targeted the air force
The air
camps,
bases.
air bases within Pakistan, that became the decisive factor in shifting the calculus, perhaps from the Pakistani side, that India was coming very close to Pakistan's nuclear establishment, perhaps, and that according to the media reports available, then that also brought in the international community, particularly the Americans, who before that were saying, taking a hands-off approach to the crisis.
Yeah,
They
that
said,
the two of them will sort it out amongst themselves, and it's a tit for tat and all of that. And, Harsh, there's another thing that I feel it exposed Pakistan on the international platform, not that there has been a lack of evidence, but this time when India struck the terror camps, and we saw that during the funeral prayers, the Pakistani army officers were going there, and the Pakistani, Chief Minister of the Punjab province, Maryam Nawaz, from her side, wreaths were laid. So the establishment or the close connect between the terror and the government, the non-state actors and the state actors, that was very evident of how they have been protected by the government.
Yes, and I think that has been quite revelatory this time, because before this, certainly there was the attempt from the establishment, Pakistani military establishment, was always to create this distance
between them,
at least for the public, for the international community. This time it was pretty evident, and I think in some ways it exposes the vulnerabilities within Pakistan, that Pakistan today, the military perhaps, is so weak and so vulnerable that it has to openly rely on the proxies for carrying out what at one point in time used to be behind the scenes. Today it is very evident up front. So I do think that this is a moment where and it would have serious repercussions going forward for Pakistani military, because certainly questions would be raised as to what really happened here, and why did Pakistani military under Munir took a position like they did, almost going back to the whole two-nation theory, the whole very theological lens to the whole conflict, and then looking at this not through a political lens explicitly. We have had army chiefs in Pakistan before, and they have also used terrorism as an instrument of state policy. But this one is different. He articulates a vision which is quite grand in theological terms, and therefore the space for political maneuvering is very limited. And I think in some ways this is a reflection of Pakistan, the military's declining credibility at home. And so attacking
Is
India
there something new that you're
very-
seeing this time, that the credibility of this army has gone down? There was a lot of respect for the Pakistani army inside the country. But now you see how Asim Munir also was nowhere to be seen after that, and is more of a theologist than a military general.
Yes, I would say that it started happening before the crisis. When he was laying out this very expansive vision of
The two-nation
Pakistani civilization versus Muslim civilization versus Hindu civilization. He has given a number of speeches in which this theme repeatedly comes up, and I think it was a reflection that Pakistani military is not doing the job what it's supposed to do, that is providing security to Pakistani people.
But they say that the Pakistani military there runs bakeries and shops and everything else, rather than looking at the army and the security.
Rather than securing people. And I think increasingly questions about particularly after Imran Khan episode, the sense that now there is a very weak civilian government which is beholden to the military. There is also the sense that within Pakistan, if you see both Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, there is a lot of turmoil there, which the Pakistani military is unable to manage. So clearly there are questions swirling around the military. And of course, when you say Kashmir is this jugular for Pakistan and we are going to go for the jugular, it also is a sense of desperation, because you saw that Kashmir was getting normalized for all the problems in Kashmir Valley. But the fact that tourism was increasing, the fact that the local population in the valley was looking towards mainstream India for economic sustenance, that link that was missing for a very long time suddenly was being built. And I think that was a real game changer, because if not now, then when? The question for Pakistani military became that if you leave this for some more time, then you lose Kashmir Valley completely. So I think that sense of desperation is also evident in his speeches, and also I think what happened in Pahalgam and thereafter, that you do see a continuum, which I think we will have to watch out and see how it evolves, because this is a very, in some ways, an inflection point for Pakistani military and its ability to do things, to do great disruption. We may all talk about the escalation dynamic, escalation ladder, who failed, who won.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the question is that Pakistani military now has to decide which way they want to go. And the questions for them are not going away. They can certainly shift the burden on some other actors for the time being. But the perennial question is, if Kashmir is not really central now to India-Pakistan discourse, then what is central? And then how do you define your identity to the Pakistani people and to the subcontinent? And I think that question remains. And I think that's what the challenge is for Pakistani military as well as for India-Pakistan relationship, because it also means that more mischief might come, more adventurous. Despite the recent ceasefire, we may continue to see a sense of inherent instability built into this.
Also because there's a desperation, like you say, is building up. If they are losing Kashmir, and it's clearly, like you said, it's an inflection point for the Pakistan military. Two new things we've seen. First of all, the people in Kashmir this time reacted differently. They were all with India. We did not hear any separatist voice, and they resented what happened because it took away their bread and butter and hit their economy. And at the same time, we see that there's a negative feeling for the army in Pakistan. So two new developments are taking place there. Now, India also, I feel, has been successful in linking the Indus Water Treaty to terrorism, the way it has been kept in abeyance because of the terror attacks that we faced. So there, what has been our achievement, and how are we going to use it as a tool against Pakistan?
I think in some ways, that is a very important shift. I would, and I think you see this, it starts with Indus Water Treaty being kept in abeyance, something that India had not touched, despite very
many
strident
wars.
calls in India to do that. And some very eminent people in India calling repeatedly that, look, this treaty is not favorable to India. The terms are more favorable to Pakistan. It should be renewed. It should be relooked at. It should be not renewed. It should be reevaluated and renegotiated. And I think you start from there and you end up at the end of the conflict, whatever has happened with the cessation of hostilities, at least as of now. India's redefining its security doctrine by saying that, look, any act of terrorism would be considered an act of war going forward. I think if you link them up, you see a certain sense in India that this is going to be the new normal, that we will not be able to absorb any costs that we were absorbing before because of, if terrorism impacts our ordinary citizens, therefore the costs should also be borne by ordinary Pakistani citizens. I think that is the link that India is drawing here. Because for a lot of time the idea was that, look, if you mess with Indus Water Treaty, it impacts Pakistanis, agriculture, it impacts Pakistani citizens in ways that perhaps you don't want. And I think now India's message is that we also would take reciprocal action if our citizens are targeted. And I think that linking it up to all the way down, saying that, look, if there are going to be any more acts of terrorism, we will take it on a war footing. I think that is the line India has drawn both from the beginning of this crisis to the end of this crisis, that this is something that is going to be the new red line for India. And I do think that would mean that increasingly the terrorism would be treated as something much more than a localized incident. And that also implies that the costs are going to be much higher for Pakistan. There'll be costs for India as well, but India is indicating that we are willing to absorb those costs, because ultimately cost absorption of terrorism has not yielded any dividends for us.
Yeah, the Harsh, I also want to understand, how did geopolitics really play out during this escalation? It was an India-Pakistan tension, shorter war. That we saw very high octane escalation last 4 or 5 days. And everyone had questions regarding role of America there, role of China there, what did Turkey do, what was Russia's stand. We had received phone calls, and India also dialed some countries. President Putin called up Prime Minister Modi. And Israel, of course, was also clearly. So we saw a lot of reactions from these countries, some very, very firm reactions, and some basically acting as mediators. So how did this play out? There were questions about what was America's role. America mediated. America has been India's strategic partner, but America also can't do away with Pakistan, right? We saw in the middle of all this, they got an IMF loan. IMF, which is dominated by America. So how do we understand this, and why was it necessary to give that loan to Pakistan, and how did that affect this conflict?
So I think there are multiple ways to look at this. One is, of course, that if you see the basic alliances emerging during the crisis itself. Of course, when Pahalgam happened, there was a lot of global sympathy for India. But ultimately, when you fight wars alone. There are you don't expect, nor do countries give you the kind of support that's true everywhere. But I think if you look at the key nations that helped Pakistan to stand out, Turkey and China. I mean, there is remarkable support that came out, both in terms of the material support that Pakistan got in terms of technology, in terms of weapons from Turkey. Turkey warships visiting Pakistan days into the conflict.
And the Turkish drones coming
being
there.
used extensively. And of course, China and China's traditional role in Pakistan and how it had built Pakistani military capability was also on display. And China's public support was also on display. China publicly always on global platforms tried to shield Pakistan. There is also very interestingly this, because we live in a world where wars are also fought at the cognitive levels, right? So misinformation campaigns, the media playing this role, Global Times and others which had to be called out for some of the reporting that they were doing. Turkish media also amplified Pakistani position. So you do see
a lot of American media too.
Yes, of course. Yeah. There were Americans doing that as well, certain sections. So if you look at the wider ambit of the Turkish-China relationship, there is of course a very solid relationship emerging. And during the crisis, the help that was being given, Americans took a more hands-off approach, given the larger inclination of Trump administration not to get involved in wars, although they have not been very successful in the 2 wars that they have been trying to resolve. And I think initially when we saw J.D. Vance's statement that, look, this is for India and Pakistan to sort out, in some ways we don't know whether it was just a cover for things that were already going back, behind the
back
scenes.
Channel,
but I think that was in sync with the larger messaging of the Trump administration that we don't want to entangle ourselves in places externally. However, I do think that at the end of the day, the crisis also showed that America still retains the kind of global heft that many people have started dissociating with America, right? We continue to say, America is a power in decline. But in some ways, America's centrality in the global order is quite evident in the way America showed itself up, both in terms of managing Pakistan and in terms of managing the crisis by and large. Now, there were a lot of other countries involved. So, for example, we saw a very, very active Saudi role being played out. back and forth between the two countries. You also had, I think, Iranians coming in.
Iranians coming in. How did the Saudis and the Iranian, what was the role that they played in the negotiations?
I'm sure the back channel, messaging that,
Yeah.
that India wanted to send because they came here and then they went to Pakistan and vice versa. I think the messaging, they would have conveyed the messages. But I think India's message by and large was very categorical from the beginning, which was that de-escalation, the ball for de-escalation was in Pakistan's court. So ultimately, Pakistan had to decide when it wanted to go off ramp. And Pakistan, by initially not deciding to go, because India did offer them, once India attacked the terror infrastructure, India made that argument that, look, this is non-escalatory. We have targeted the terror infrastructure. We are not targeting the military or civilian installations. So there is room there for maneuver, which Pakistan had, which it did not take. So I do think that at that point in time, perhaps it becomes important for doing back and forth between the countries that they did. But ultimately, I think it was the threat of escalation when perhaps India had stuck too close to Pakistani establishment in Rawalpindi and in Islamabad, and also certain very interesting places like Kahuta. I think the message was going out that it could escalate very quickly, and Americans therefore had to come in and also give the message. Whatever media reports that are available, I think India's message was that, look, Pakistan has to de-escalate, but if we are attacked, we will respond very, very strongly. So in that sense, I think the messaging would have been to Pakistan that, look, this is the moment to de-escalate perhaps. And so I think we have seen a curious way of finding an off-ramp in Pakistan where Shehbaz Sharif has gone and said, oh, this is a great victory for Pakistan. There's a speech that he gave. It's quite extraordinary because he's never specifying what that victory symbol or what is the manifestation of that victory. He's just saying that, oh, we have achieved this great victory.
Of course.
So it's not evident what objectives were served.
Whereas, and the difference was that the Indian military in the joint press briefing clearly showed video evidence of what we gained, what we did, right? And the foreign minister there too on an interview in a foreign channel is saying that the evidence is on social media. So what victory are they talking about? And that's the difference. They've been hitting civilian targets. India hit out only at the terror camps. And that was also like a response to what happened in Pahalgam. So that was a difference between India, Pakistan here. That was very evident.
Yes, I think in some ways India's calibrated response was also underscoring India's capabilities, that India is capable in a very restrained manner in attacking targets that really matter. At the end of the day, Pakistan, whatever weaponry was available, they just put it across through to India, targeting here, there, everywhere. With the civilians, or in some cases they tried to but failed in almost all cases. None of our military installations they could target. But India could, in a very calibrated manner, showcase its prowess, that we are very capable of hitting where it hurts. And that, I think, has changed the calculus in some ways, that look, today there are differences between India and Pakistan. With all the support that Pakistan has from various of its supporters, India retains the ability to shape the escalation ladder in ways that is disadvantageous to Pakistan. And at the end of the day, I think that's the wider message of the new lines of deterrence that has been created. So I think what we see, for example, since 2014 onwards, you had Uri strikes, then you had the Balakot air strikes, and now that there is both India that India is now using strategic risk to shape the calculus of its adversaries and also of its partners like the US. If in Kargil and Parakram, India was saying that we are absorbing the costs and therefore we want your support to the Americans, today India is saying we are willing to escalate, and because of those risks, in some ways America has to intervene. I think there is a shift in that approach, by India, and that is the reason why we continue to see American involvement. We continue to see international involvement the way it has emerged. I think going forward, there is some concern in India about the ability of, the willingness of America to mediate or to sort of again rehyphenate India and Pakistan. I personally don't think that rehyphenation is a possibility given what we are going through. But we should
Was
also
that the message that India and Pakistan was being hyphenated again? Was that the message that came across?
I don't think that message. I mean, I think Mr. Trump's tweets and some of the other messaging that has come out from the US perhaps is, is very similar. If you recall when Imran Khan had gone in Trump's first administration, Trump then also had said, I'm willing to do, I'm willing to mediate on Kashmir, etc. So I don't think there is any of that grand design there. But I also think that we should not look at this crisis simply as a standalone crisis. It is also a crisis that is being played out against the backdrop of bigger developments in the world, which is the contestation between the US and China and how they are negotiating the terms of their engagement. So I think in some ways, the India-Pakistan relationship or conflict or the crisis, this particular crisis, is also part of that larger geopolitical flux. And so how India and Pakistan relate to each other going forward, and also relate to some of their partners and allies in the world, that would determine both the context of their foreign policy, but also in some ways would determine the contours of broader American foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. And just if you can elaborate upon that a little for our viewers to understand that how did that really play out, the conflict between America and China and the trade war, because a lot of publications, newspapers, and a lot of theories are floating around that it was basically about the US-China trade war.
I don't think it was primarily that. I think India and Pakistan have their own agency. They shape their own behavior and their foreign policy in their own ways. And I don't think what happened in Pahalgam or Asim Munir's idea of India-Pakistan relationship has anything to do with it. But I certainly think that in many ways, the broader sense of this conflict, and India has played it very well in terms of calibrating its response and in terms of making it clear that India doesn't want to get sucked into a quagmire of war from which you can't extricate yourself, because India's primary foreign policy objective is economic development. We want to be able to continue to grow. We want to continue to be an economic power that shapes global outcomes. We don't want to be sucked into a nightmarish situation with Pakistan. Pakistan may be going down the drain, but we don't want to go along with Pakistan. Yeah. So economically, India, I think, has its sights set elsewhere, and therefore it was important. And I think many of the social media commentary about why this is a disappointment misunderstands the nature of the strategic landscape that India envisions for itself and for the world. And I do think that in that sense, what is happening between US and China is also something that will impact India's own trajectory. And often we talk of this being India's moment. It was very interesting that the two stories that came out a few days back on global front pages was, on the one hand you had India finalizing the free trade agreement with the UK, and on the other you had the Operation Sindoor starting. Yes. So you had this juxtaposition of of something global and more ambitious in India's mood, that we now are at a stage where we can be part of the larger global economic order that is being shaped by both China's pushback against US and US taking on China. So that, I think, is the big story. And certainly India's ability to deter Pakistan, or continuing ability to deter and shape Pakistani behavior, is also the reality that we continue to be circumscribed in some ways by the neighborhood in which we live and the challenges that we face there. So ultimately a balance will have to be struck. But the fact that India decided to take on Pakistan the way it did, and then ultimately also decided to end this, because we never wanted a war in the first place. And I think for India not to end up in that situation is a good outcome by and large.
Sure. One last question just to conclude. What did this conflict show about our, on the global platform, our alliances, and about our strategic partners, and India's diplomatic heft and who all came together and the kind of support India got, and what are the big questions that remain after this conflict? Because this is a temporary ceasefire. Pakistan is our neighbor, will be there, will create problems. All that will be there. Escalations are possible anytime. So, what are the questions that remain?
I think the fundamental question that remains is that how will, what kind of a modus vivendi India and Pakistan will find to move forward. Because ultimately, even in that, for that question to be answered, the ball is in Pakistan's court. They have to decide how they want to live with India. I don't think Munir doctrine is the one that is going to sustain for very long. So that's the one question. The other is, of course, this sense as to what do we do with China. Ultimately, that's the real strategic challenge. So how do you relate to China in a changing world order? We have we are looking at a possibility of some kind of a trade deal between US and China coming out very soon. We have also our own trading agreement with America, bilateral trade agreement that is on the cards. So clearly, I think the stakes for India are much higher. Pakistan is not looking at it through an economic or developmental prism. It is a very militarized prism that they have for their foreign policy. But India has a developmental prism through which the larger foreign policy questions are settled. And then finally, I think the question that still remains on the table is what kind of a partnership will India have with the US under a very volatile Trump administration. So while by and large Trump even I would argue in this case, America has taken care of Indian interests. Yes, they have supported Pakistan, in terms of giving them aid, in terms of the IMF support. But I think at the end goal, if it turns out to be the one that we are envisioning at this point, then that's not a very unfavorable outcome. But the question remains, the way Mr. Trump has framed it, as you were mentioning earlier, whether this can circumscribe India's options going forward, and what kind of a partnership under the Trump administration will we see, being envisaged by both sides. I think those are some of the fundamental questions that will come up immediately as this crisis ends, and as India creates a new normal with Pakistan, and also finds a new modus vivendi with the US in particular on trade and on broader technology and economic partnership.
But also that remains a question, what will be the new normal with Pakistan? Thank you so much for all that discussion, Harsh. And that's it that we have on this episode of Ideas Factory. Thank you for watching.